or whatever, and then I'm driving to this dead end, and there's like
Right.
tumbleweeds, you know, and like you guys have been here for so long, it seems like there should be a nice big sign there that should say, hey, this is a historic business that's here, you know, and
Well, it is true, we really should have something out there on Ryan off of Gilbert, you know, and I don't know what it would take to do that. I know there'd be some type of signage requirement or permit or something, but that is a good idea. We need to do that. And we did talk about it in the early, we've been here at this location for 4 years, but when we first moved over here, they still had all of the smaller signs that the city had put out pointing the Quantum helicopters to our old building, which was now empty. The city owned that building and did not rent it for some time. So we were having people in the first 3 or 4 months like, oh, we were driving around the airport and thought you went out of business, you know. But we have that problem solved pretty much now. But we really need to get something. It's true out there, one on Ryan and Gilbert, and then one right down at the end.
yeah.
For nothing else, it'd just be helpful, you know, to customers.
It'll be helpful to customers, but I think it's also a nice little PR
Yeah,
thing
it is.
because you guys have been here, you've been a part of the airport for a long time, and when you get into the airport and you see John's Place and the other ones, they've got kind of big signs, you know, with their names on it and that kind of thing. So, I don't know. I'm just thinking like people driving down the road would be like, oh, Quantum helicopters, that's interesting. What's that? You know? Otherwise, they'll never maybe even know that you guys are back there, so that they see some helicopters off in the distance. But.
Well, in 2006, when we built this building,
Oh, stand by. That sounds like good stuff because I'm ready to go. Just looking for a point to jump in. Sorry, sir. That was a.
I could have asked them to tell me that again.
Okay. I don't. But yeah, he said he had someone at 1, so. And
Hold that
so
thought.
Autoyo's going out actually, so we're good to go there. Everything's looking good.
This building was in 2006?
say again?
This building was built in 2006?
Well, I was saying when we built this building in 2006, there was quite a plan to, you know, this whole side of the airport is eventually going to develop. We were the first building on this side of the airport, on the east side, southeast side. So, but the economy going into a tailspin kind of delayed a lot of those projects on this side of the airport. So eventually, that Ryan Road that you're coming down will turn and parallel all of the business development on the south side of the airport. So at that time, you know, it won't be as difficult to find the businesses that are on this side of the airport.
Mm-hmm. Right, makes sense. Okay,
You're rolling.
all right. Well, let's go back and talk a little bit about your family history.
Okay.
So we'll start with that. Tell me the names of your parents and where they were from.
My father is named James Jones, and he actually moved to Chandler when he was 2 years old, 2 or 3. So he's been in Chandler since he was a very small boy. And my mother was born in Buckeye, Arizona, and actually moved to Chandler when they were married in, I believe, 1960 or so. So they've been in Chandler together for a long time.
What's your mother's name?
My mom's name is Aline Jones.
Aline?
Aline.
A-L...
A-L-L-E-N-E.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when was your dad born? Just as a...
Oh boy.
as a marker of when he came to Chandler.
I believe that he was born in 1935, I believe. So I think he would have moved here with his family in about 37.
So where was on the Jones side, where were they from originally? which state or another city or?
My grandparents on my father's side were farmers from Oklahoma. So they moved to Chandler, Arizona, looking for farm work back in the 30s. And my grandmother actually worked for many years at the San Marcos Hotel, which is another kind of a Chandler icon. But my grandfather, until he died, which was in the early 60s, was a farmer.
Now, when they came from, did they come from Oklahoma to Chandler?
Mm-hmm.
And were they coming as like cotton workers, like part of that migrating group, or were they coming as like to buy a farm and have a farm?
No, they were part of the migrating group of farmers that were just, or farm workers that were just looking for work in those days, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, you know, times were fairly hard in the Midwest and in the Oklahoma and in those areas, you know, and that's what prompted them to try to go out and look for work, and they ended up in the Gilbert Chandler area.
Do you know if they came directly to the Gilbert Chandler area, or did they go to some different places in Arizona before they ended up here?
I don't think so. The stories I've always heard is that I don't know how they found Chandler. I know that the Goodrich farms, you know, which, as I understand it, became the Bogle family farms later on. I think that's where they found work, and my grandfather and one of my uncles worked there for many years. My father also worked on the Bogle farms part-time for many years in his younger days, and I actually worked there for one summer as a teenager. So that the farming industry, you know, and those, you know, up until recently, the Chandler area was very agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of agricultural business in this area, so they all had a hand and a foot in that.
What's the name of your grandparents?
My grandmother's name was Sado Jones, and my grandfather's name was. Okay, now you're testing me.
You can keep talking about it.
I never met him. I gotta think of his name now. Oscar. Sado and Oscar Jones. It sounds like
Oscar?
Oklahoma names from the
And
30s.
Is it like S-A-T?
S-A-D A-O, I think is S-A-D-A-O, I think is how she spelled it.
Wow, that's an interesting name. Sado.
Sado and Oscar Jones.
And so, when they came in 37, you're thinking that they came to the Goodyear farm area?
Well, not Goodyear, but there was the farms that are just south of Chandler, which is now all of the Ocotillo area.
Mm-hmm.
That was, I believe, owned by the Goodyear or Goodrich Rubber
Goodyear.
Company.
Goodyear.
So that's where they worked, and those farms in later years were known as the Bogle farms. The Bogle family ran all of that operation down there. So that's where they worked as far back as I can remember.
Mm-hmm. Did they live in the Goodyear area?
No, again, as far back as I can remember, my grandparents lived in Chandler.
In Chandler, okay.
They may have had a stint of time that they had a house in Gilbert way probably before I was born, but my memory was always of them living in Chandler, in the old part of Chandler, you know, on the 2 or 3 housing blocks that were just to the east of the high school, Chandler High School.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's where I can always remember them living. They had a house or two in that area.
So, east of Arizona Avenue?
East of Arizona Avenue, and all of the streets named after the states, you know, Washington, Colorado. That's where I can remember them living as I was growing up. My grandfather actually died before I was born, but my grandmother and some of the other aunts and uncles lived there in just east of the high school, or east of Arizona Avenue.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you're talking about all these little historical pieces of Chandler, and
Mm-hmm.
that area is they call it the Silk Stocking neighborhood,
Mhm.
and they're currently working on trying to get it on the National Register of Historic Places. So it'd be interesting to find out if your family has had a house in that area that they're trying to create a district from. Would be kind of neat.
Well, I can remember that far back. I know that my grandmother owned a house on Colorado Street at one time and on Washington Street.
Okay.
And the first house that I actually lived in after I was married, I rented a house from my grandmother, which was on Colorado Street. I don't remember the exact address, but it was a little old, very charming, I think it was 950 square foot house that was on Colorado Street in Chandler.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's great. That's a great history there. I'll just back up for the purpose of the audio interview. This is Jean Reynolds, and I'm interviewing Neil Jones today, and it's October 25th, 2010. So just a little introduction there. So we were talking about your family, the Jones family, and kind of their history in Chandler. And now your mom was Aline, and what do you know her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Aline Owens.
And she was from Buckeye?
She was born in Buckeye and actually lived in several cities across the state in her growing up because my grandfather on her side was a minister, a pastor, and he pastored several churches in Arizona as she was growing up. And if I have the story correct, I believe that she was born in Buckeye, lived in a few other cities during her childhood and growing up, and actually graduated back from Buckeye High School. I think that's where she graduated high school at, so not exactly positive about all that, but I think that's how it went on her side.
What denomination were they?
He is an Assembly of God pastor, my grandfather was. He's retired, of course, now, but still living, but retired.
Okay. You know your maternal side, your grandparents, the Owens, their names?
Oh yes, Leonard Owens, it was my grandfather, the Reverend, and his wife, who has passed on now, was Mamie Owens.
Another great name from that
Yes,
generation.
and I believe that, at least I know my grandmother Mamie, I'm almost positive that she was born and grew up in Oklahoma also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A lot of Oklahoma roots there.
Yes.
That's good. Myself, I have some Texas and
Yeah.
going back that way. Okay, so your parents, how did they meet each other before they got married in 1960?
I believe that they met somehow or another at a church function of some type. I'm not sure what it was, but my mother was living in Prescott at that time. My grandfather was pastoring a church there, and my father was still here in Chandler. I believe he was on the police force at the time that they met, in the Chandler Police Force. So I'm not sure exactly where they met, but I believe it was a church function, and then they started dating, and they were married in 1960.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about the kind of occupation that your father had.
My father was out of high school pretty much, became a Chandler police officer, and started in 1956. He was actually badge number 9 on the Chandler Police Force. And so all of my, childhood years and growing up and almost through high school, he retired from the Chandler Police Department in my junior year, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was elected as the county constable. So his second career was as a constable for Maricopa County. And he worked out of the Chandler precinct. And he since then has retired from that position also.
How long was he as a county constable?
He was
Like from 78 to...
roughly 20 years. He
Okay.
did another 20 years as constable, and I think he was on the police department for 21 or 22.
Great. So was he Did he graduate in 55 then? Or was it 56? Or did he start like right after? If he started as a police officer in 56, was it like right the same year that he graduated?
I think yes, he graduated in either 55 or 56, and I believe he started very soon after that as a dispatcher for the police department.
And from Chandler High.
And he graduated from Chandler High.
Okay, so you got
Yeah,
a couple generations there.
yeah.
That's great. Okay. Did he ever tell you any interesting stories about his early days as a police officer? Because things were a lot different back in the 50s and the 60s than they are now. So.
Yes, I can remember him telling me that the earlier part of his career, you know, like so many businesses, that there was a lot less paperwork, and that they actually, Chandler was so much smaller of a town that it was more personal than it could be in a town of this size now, or even larger. So I was always impressed that he always told people that he became a police officer because he really had a desire to help people, and that was kind of his personality in those days. And he was very helpful, very outgoing, and ready to do anything for anybody, just about. You know, I remember that part of him, not only as a police officer, but in his private life also, growing up. So he was a good example in that way, and he really did. During the later part of his career, I was able to spend a lot of time with him when I was in junior high and just in the high school, riding along with him as he was doing the police work in the later part of his career, and really enjoyed that, watching them, him and some of the other, what would be called old timers now. They probably wouldn't like that, but some of whom I still stay in contact with, the police officers from that generation. And it was really fun. It was a little less, you know, probably technical, and like he used to say, a lot less paperwork in the beginning. But he really enjoyed it, and that made it fun to be with him and experience his job, especially towards the end of his career.
Mm-hmm. Were there any, you know, I'm thinking about this because I've done an interview with a volunteer firefighter, and he had all these really kind of interesting stories about that, you know. And it might be great at some point to talk to your dad, but
Well,
he's...
one of the things he likes to tell everybody is he's delivered several babies as a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I can always remember him. It sounds kind of contradictory, but he was always kind of known for that side of him. You know, he was very kind, and I think he says he's delivered 3 or 4 babies. I can't remember the exact number. And for periods during my childhood, I can remember him even staying in touch with a couple of the impromptu mothers that he would just happen to be working when the babies came, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also one that was very adamant about his, he was very protective of his, he was a sergeant, street sergeant, so very protective of his, the guys that were working under him, and very adamant that they took care of each other, and you know, I can still, one of his, I guess you would say his proteges, or one of the people that he was responsible for training in those days, is a good friend of mine now, still works for the police department, and his name is John Summers. And John is always telling me, you know, your dad was always adamant that we, you know, took care of each other, and that we did what the citizens of Chandler expected us to do. So it was kind of neat to hear those stories, you know, about his personality.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of a tough guy, you know, but he also had a pretty soft side.
Okay. Did your mom work at all, or was she at home with you?
My mom did a lot of volunteer work when we were growing up, but she never had a job outside of the house. She was a homemaker and a mother, and a very good one. So we always appreciated that we had her at home, my brother and I.
Okay. Before we jump to kind of a little bit about your story, I want to ask you one more question, and this is kind of airport related, but with the police department. I know we've heard about the police department having a shooting range.
Mhm.
Do you know any of that history, how it got established or when, or kind of how that got going?
Well, I know it had to be pretty early. I don't remember very much about the shooting range that was in Chandler at the airport. But I do remember it. I remember being very young, probably grade school age, and coming down to the shooting range with my dad when they were doing their qualifying and training. And I do remember the concept that it was located on the airport, you know. I can remember running around and shooting BB guns with other kids that would, you know, hang out at the airport in those days. There was an old terminal which no longer is standing, and then the shooting range and a great big berm, you know, that served as the backstop for the police range. And then it was always fascinating as kids for us to be able to see there weren't a lot of airplanes at the Chandler Airport back then, but there were a few. So it was always fun to come out and go to the range with Dad, you know. So, but I don't remember specifically a lot about it. Just the trips that we'd make when we were kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what year were you born?
I was born in December of '61, the day after Christmas.
Okay, December 26th.
Mm-hmm.
And where were you born?
I was born in the Chandler Hospital. Not the one that you would know as the Chandler Hospital, but the one that was on McQueen, just south of Chandler Boulevard, which was Williamsfield at that time, I think.
Okay. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one brother, Kevin.
Is he older or younger?
He's 3 years younger.
Okay. And you grew up in Chandler?
My brother?
You did?
Yes, I did, yes.
Grew up in Chandler. What schools did you attend in Chandler?
Oh, man. I first went to school at Hartford Elementary, and then my parents moved after that year, and I spent so I moved around a lot in the beginning. Hartford School for first grade, and then Cleveland Elementary, which is really old time Chandler history. That elementary school is now part of the high school.
Mm-hmm.
Cleveland Elementary for second grade, and then Erie School opened when I was a third grader, so I went to Erie School for third grade until I started junior high at the old Chandler Junior High School,
Mm-hmm.
which is part of the high school campus now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finished off at Chandler High School and graduated in 1980.
Okay. Now, while you were in high school, were you involved, beyond kind of just the academic setting, were you involved in extracurricular activities?
Not much. I played freshman basketball and wasn't very good. And in my sophomore year is when I got involved in flying. And after I got exposed to flying and got kind of, that kind of became an obsession with me. So after that, it was pretty much all of my free time and extra money and everything else got poured into flying. But I was not terribly involved. It wasn't much of academic or the high school thing. Wasn't terribly interested in that per se. I probably wasn't the best high school student, but I really enjoyed Chandler High School. I had a lot of friends and
Mm-hmm.
and it was a good place to go to high school.
What neighborhood were you living in while you were in high school?
I lived just down the street from Erie School on Apache Boulevard, or Apache Drive, 6 houses down from the entrance to Erie School.
Okay.
So that's Alma School and Chandler Boulevard, basically.
So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in aviation. How did that come about?
Well, I can remember being really obsessed with helicopters when I was in second grade. And my mother has saved some of those things when I was in Cleveland School in Mrs. Hargrave's class, who was probably my favorite teacher of all time, at least in the top two. For some reason, I think it was a television show that had helicopters related, or was about helicopters, I'm not sure, but I was really fascinated by helicopters very early, and then as I got older, I didn't have really any exposure to it, or no one in my family flew airplanes or helicopters. But after my sophomore year of high school, a good friend of mine that was in the same year as I was, we were all looking for summer jobs, and he called me and said, hey, there's an aviation business out here at the Chandler Airport that's looking for summer help, and they were hiring young kids, to help. And that was Santan Dusters, owned by Mr. Copeland, Bob Copeland. And so I drove out to the airport and interviewed for the job and got hired as a ground crew person, or a flagger. Back then, all of the crop dusting operators used flaggers to mark their positions as they flew across the fields, and that was my first kind of real job, other than mowing lawns and doing things that my dad would make me do. Mr. Copeland was operating both airplanes and helicopters in those days, and it took me about 3 days to become completely obsessed with aviation. It didn't take long. Just being around them and working with them every day and hanging out with the pilots, that was about all it took, and I was pretty much obsessed after my sophomore. That was the end of my sophomore year, that summer, and that's what really got me interested in aviation from that point on.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about, for those of us not really familiar with kind of the crop dusting history and how that operation works, and in particular kind of what your position would have entailed, what you would have done, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about when you started the job, kind of what was the process for doing that, the crop dusting and exactly what you were doing as a flagger.
Well, Chandler had already enjoyed a long history in that field in crop dusting before I started working there, which would have been about 78, I believe, the summer of 78. So there were established businesses that had already operated from the Chandler Airport. At that time, Santan Dusters was the only crop dusting operation used in Chandler. And like you would expect for a 16-year-old, I mean, it was a very entry-level job. It was kind of a grunt position, to go out and flag all night for the crop dusters, because most of the work they did was at night because of the climate and other things. So it was kind of a difficult entry-level type position, but as you can imagine, at 16, being able to work with in that type of an environment and being obsessed with aviation, it was wonderful for me. I mean, I just couldn't. I spent a year working as a flagger, which marked the position, of the. Now that's all done by GPS. The airplanes and helicopters are all equipped with GPS positioning, so they don't have to have flaggers. Mm-hmm. But in those days, it was all done manually by people walking along the edge of the field and either waving a flag, hence the term flaggers, or with flashlights at night to line the airplanes and helicopters up so they could keep their position across the field. So I did that for a year, and then I graduated, so to speak, up to mixing chemicals and driving the loading trucks for the airplanes and helicopters. And I did that during the years that I was finishing high school and just out of high school and working on all of my airplane certificates and ratings and helicopter ratings.
Okay. So describe what your typical day would have been, or evening, I guess, kind of like from start to finish as a flagger?
Well, usually the way that we did it here in Arizona, and it differed from state to state, but because of the very hot climate in Arizona, we would start usually by getting a phone call at 4:30 or so in the afternoon, and that phone call would alert us as to when we needed to show up at the airport for that evening's work. And usually we would show up anywhere from 10 p.m. at night to 2 a.m. in the morning, and then work until the work was done. It was a kind of industry where, I learned a lot from Mr. Copeland, and his work ethic was really superb. And in those days, you couldn't afford to get behind, so we would work until sometimes it would be an 8-hour shift, and sometimes literally we'd work almost 24 hours. And then the work would all be assigned at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and we'd start again the next day, depending on how much work had come in the previous day. So most of the work being at night, but some of it being during the day also.
Okay. So would they call you and say, come to the airport, and then they're gonna drive you out to where you're gonna go work at, or like, and then?
No, we had trucks, which was part of the allure of the job for a 16-year-old. 16, 17, most of us had barely figured out how to drive, to get to the airport. And then as flaggers, they would put us in company trucks, and we would tear off, through the fields and on the roadways. It was a much different geographical setting back then. It was a lot more agriculture than it is now, but we had a blast, and probably shouldn't admit this but we had a lot of fun learning how to drive in those company vehicles, and to a smaller extent they even had some company motorcycles, which were even more fun. So we loved coming to work in those days. I mean, we would get tired in the busyness of the season, but it was a great job. I always considered it to be a wonderful job for a young person who was interested in aviation, and we were able to make a lot more money than we could have working at fast food or something like that. So we really enjoyed it, me and the group of folks that I worked with.
Give me a little more detail on what you had been doing as a flagger.
Well, that's kind of what you did. The pilots would divide up the work for that evening, and they would say, here's where we're going to go first, second, third, and fourth, and so on. And we would drive to the field, and one flagger would get on one end, and the other flagger would get on the other end. And then when the airplane or helicopter got there and started spraying, we would work in usually 60-foot swaths and work our way all the way to the end of the field. And when we were done with that field, one flagger would drive down, pick up the other one, and we'd be off to the next one.
Okay.
And we'd just work until all the fields were finished, and then that would be the end of the day.
Did you ever have anything interesting or
Well, a lot of interesting.
challenging, or anything that ever had, like a story that jumps out to you as far as being a flagger?
Well, the biggest story probably being a flagger was one of my dear friends who still is, Donnie Jones and I, no relation, but his father was a businessman in Chandler in those days, and we were the same age. We were flagging together kind of as a team in the years that the Tyson gang broke out of I believe they were in the prison in Florence. And they were kind of terrorizing Arizona in those days, and they had family in Maricopa. And so during the time that the Tyson gang was loose, we were out flagging all night in some of the areas that they had been spotted in, or that the police were looking for them. And we tried to, we were 16 years old, we tried to act as brave and tough as we could, but it was really scary. I mean, I can remember as soon as the airplane would leave to go back and refuel or to get more chemicals, we would really be a nervous wreck, because we were just sure the Tyson gang was going to show up anytime. And in fact, the night that they caught them, Koch the brothers anyway, to end that whole era. We were not very far down the street. I think we were 3 or 4 miles working that night from where they actually rounded up the gang to end that whole saga. So that was pretty scary. And the rest of the experiences as a flagger and a loader were pretty much, we just enjoyed working with the airplanes and watching them fly and dreaming. And, of course, for me, it became a dream of mine. And as I was learning to fly myself and work myself up the ladder, I got or developed more and more admiration for the pilots that I was working with. They were all kind of heroes at that point in my life. So that was part of what made it so much fun for me too. Plus the driving. I mean, the having being out in the rural areas like that and being able to experience driving the way that we did probably is responsible for all my poor driving habits now. Because we really worked those vehicles. I hate for Mr. Copeland to hear that now. I know you're going to interview him too, but we got our money's worth out of the vehicles and learned how to speed and do Brodies and all kinds of jump things, and it was kind of like Smoking the Bandit every night. But we had a good time, and we usually got the work done also.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah.
Now we're this is something that's been kind of brought up, but as far as like with the process of doing the crop dusting, actual dropping the chemicals, were you sprayed with the chemicals too, or like how did that work out?
Well, that was inherent. You couldn't work doing what we were doing and not be sprayed every once in a while anyway. It wasn't something that happened all the time or a lot, but occasionally it would happen. And but it wasn't a regular thing that after you had worked in that industry a little bit, you figured out pretty quickly how to avoid that, and that was a pretty important thing to the pilots and everybody else that was working there, is to keep as much of the chemicals off you as you could. I came along at a time where the chemicals were more synthetic and they weren't as dangerous as the generation before, where they were using mostly poison. So it wasn't nearly as dangerous as it may have been 10 or 15 years earlier when I started working there. But we avoided as much as we could, and everybody kind of was clued into that.
Mm-hmm.
tried to avoid that as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you worked for Bob Copeland, and you talked about that he was someone who had a pretty strong work ethic, and that kind of influenced you. What other characteristics of Mr. Copeland do you remember that kind of stand out in your mind as like thinking about him and how you would describe him as this kind of long-time aviation person in Chandler?
Well, I worked pretty much the last 3 years or maybe 4 years that I worked in that industry before I started flying for a living myself. I worked directly for Mr. Copeland. I drove the truck that actually he would land on. It had a platform on top of it. They were really cool trucks, and they were his own design. He built them, during the winter and the off season. He would build these trucks, him and the mechanics that worked for him, and they would have I think it was a 16 by 8 foot platform on top with the chemical tanks and fuel tanks below. So I actually worked directly with him on a day-to-day basis and kind of ran the ground crews for the rest of his operation. So I got to know him fairly well, and I've told people over the years, him and my father were the two hardest working people I've ever seen. When he was working, he could outwork anybody. I mean, and I was very impressed by that. He could fly all night long and then work on an aircraft because he was a rated mechanic also, work on an aircraft half the day, go home and take a nap, and then fly all night long the next night. And he never left any work on the table. We knew when we were working with Mr. Copeland that whatever work came in, we were going to work till we finished it. And that has really, in those days, sometimes being a young kid, you would kind of be a little grumpy about that, you know, because we all wanted to, during the summer, you know, hang out with friends and play, and we still had opportunities to do that, but sometimes we'd like to take a break. But I really learned about running, learned a lot from just watching him, you know. He wasn't a terribly vocal teacher, but I learned a lot by watching what he did and how he did things, and he was very professional, took very good care of his aircraft, and spared no expense to, you know, to make sure that they were safe and maintained well. And in the business that he was in, like most aviation businesses, there are opportunities to skimp if you want to, and Bob never did that, you know. So I did learn a lot from him, and it was a great training opportunity for me, although I didn't really recognize that probably at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was great working with him and even some of the other pilots that had such a great work ethic and had such a safety ethic. You know, they were very responsible, safe aircraft operators.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to carry that through. That still influences how I do things today.
Great. And then just one more question about working with the Santan Dusters. What was kind of the region that they worked?
Well, predominantly, we worked within a 6-mile radius of the airport. Predominantly, that was where most of the work was positioned. However, during the last couple of years I worked for Santan, we did pretty much all of the work on the Salt River Reservation. That was all of the cotton and some of the vegetable work that was up there in those years was done by helicopters. So Mr. Copeland had the only 2 helicopters working for that in that industry in the local area. So we spent many days and long hours spraying up on the Salt River Reservation, and then we would work as far west as Avondale. We had some work that far west, and then as far south as the Picacho Peak area. We actually, but those jobs were not as regular, so to speak, as the work right around the Chandler area. I mean, people that live in Chandler now would never imagine or couldn't imagine the places that we were, that the pilots, not me in those days, but people couldn't imagine where the airstrips were. You know, now they're neighborhoods, but there were several dirt strips around this area, and most of the work was very close, probably within 6-7 miles of the Chandler Airport.
Okay. All right. So you can kind of work in, like, you know, kind of the jobs that you were doing, but also your aviation training itself. But basically, once you finished up at Santan, how long were you working for Santan?
I worked for Santan for 6 years.
6 years. Okay. And during that time, you were getting your aviation, your flight training?
Yep, I signed up to learn to fly right after my sophomore year, or sophomore summer. One of the pilots from Santan gave me a ride in a Cessna, and that was all it took to get me signed up. So I signed up the next day and started taking airplane lessons.
Okay, so let's start with that. What do you remember about that first ride in your Cessna?
I just remember being completely gung-ho, I guess would be the word. You know, I from that point until, I don't know, probably 6 years later, when I actually started working as a pilot, I just pretty much ate, slept, and breathed aviation. You know, I started flying airplanes. My fascination really was with helicopters. You know, I was working every day with Mr. Copeland by then, and had a lot of time spent around the helicopters. So, but in those days it was very difficult. There were no flight schools like ours back then. Very difficult for a civilian to get into the helicopter world, and very expensive if you did. So I started flying fixed wing as a way to get into the industry, and started taking lessons at Chandler Air Service. and that's where I obtained my private pilot certificate. And then I'd work all summer and save money, and then all winter I would spend it doing some other aviation rating or certificate. And that it took me about 6 years of that work and save. You know, there were no real educational loans or student loans for that type of training. So you had to just, you know, my dad helped me as much as he could, my parents financially, but it took about 6 years to get to the point where I could really step out and be hireable and as a pilot. So those years I worked at, you know, Santan in the summer and made as much money as you could, and then spent it all up during the winter.
Okay. So what once you finished those 6 years and then you actually went into flying as a career, kind of how did that happen, and what did you first start with?
Well, my first my actual first job was right out of high school, very early out of high school, flying for Mr. Varga, who I think is another person that you mentioned that you might interview, but Mr. Varga George hired me at 18 to fly or ferry new aircraft. The Varga Kachina aircraft were being built on this airport then, and I did several delivery flights, or we call them ferry flights, across the country to different locations for the Varga organization. George's father was also still alive at that time, so I got to know him, and he's a great aviation, has a great aviation history. But that was probably the first thing that I can remember doing that was actually work related, flying airplanes for Varga across the country. And then I did start airplane flight instruction. I was an airplane flight instructor kind of at the same time the delivery flights were happening. And did that for a period of time. And then one of the things I'd always wanted to do, of course, being from that background, was I was able to work for one summer as an actual crop duster. I got a job, or in that industry it's called a seat. It was kind of an entry-level position for another business who had been located at the Chandler Airport in those days. Mr. Kirk, Leland Kirk, started a company at Chandler, and I flew for him for one summer, which was my first step into that was in airplanes, but that was my first step into the crop dusting industry as a pilot, which was some of the most enjoyable and fun flying I've ever done. But at the end of that season, or that summer, I was offered my first helicopter job as a flight instructor with a company out of Scottsdale, and started flying helicopters with them. That company started to grow and prosper a little bit, and from that point on I never had any flying position or employment flying airplanes again. It's all been helicopter after that.
What was that Scottsdale company?
It was Arizona Wing and Rotor.
So
Can I just have one sentence where you said, like, I started flying at that, and name that place in a sentence, whatever the name of it was?
Arizona Wing and Rotary.
Yes.
I started my helicopter flying experience as an employee anyway, a working helicopter pilot at Arizona Wing and Rotor, which was based out of Scottsdale, the Scottsdale Air Park.
Okay. How did you get that helicopter flying experience?
Well, along with having finished several of my airplane certificates and ratings, I finally had the opportunity in 1980, right after I graduated high school. The Robinson Helicopter Company started producing small, very reliable and inexpensive. All helicopters are expensive, relatively speaking, but the R-22 was put on the market by Robinson Helicopter Company, and dropped the price of a civilian learning to fly by roughly in half. So what had become, or had been very difficult and very expensive to obtain in the civilian world, that being helicopter training, all of a sudden became possible. And I can still remember seeing my first ad in a magazine with an R-22 and seeing the pricing in those days, which was again about half of what had always been in the past. And I can remember thinking, man, I might be able to figure out a way to beg, borrow, and steal enough money, you know, to get this done now. And that's in fact kind of what happened. The R-22 started to change the civilian helicopter market in the early days, and it made it possible for people that wanted to do it bad enough to obtain helicopter training and certification in the civilian market. So this school that I eventually went to work for in Scottsdale, Arizona Wing and Rotor, I ended up finishing my instructor's training at that school, and then eventually went to work for them in 1984.
So while you were taking that, you know, that initial training, flying a helicopter, who were some of the other people that were like training alongside of you? Do you remember?
Well,
Some of those that like the types of careers, whatever that they would have gone into.
well, in the very early days that I was doing my training, there literally were very few students. I mean, it was which was very kind of cool, and it was enjoyable to be part of that first generation. But when this R-22 hit the market and people started to develop dealerships and flight schools, it was a very small industry, and there weren't very many other students. But some of the earlier students that I flew with literally have flown all over the globe now. I mean, and then subsequently some of the people that we went on to train, both at Arizona Wing and Rotor, and then after I started Quantum Helicopters here, we have pilots, ex-graduates of ours that are flying literally all over the world. I mean, Japan, Mexico, the Middle East, all over America. So that's been very satisfying and kind of fun too, to see all of these people who at one point or another sat in your office with no experience whatsoever, just having a dream like I did, wanting to be a pilot, and now seeing them, many of them are running companies, you know, and are very high up in their organizations, and have done very well for themselves. So that's fun and exciting to see. It's a neat part of being part of the training industry.
Were there any local pilots that trained in Scottsdale with you that went on to do, like, for example, work for the news media, any of that kind of, like any of those types of names that
Sure.
you have connections with?
In fact, probably the best known local pilot that we trained many years ago is Bruce Hafner, and Bruce has become a very good friend of mine, and his story is just an awesome success story. Bruce was a cameraman, you know, and a very successful cameraman with Channel 3, but he really wanted to be a pilot in the early 90s, about the time that he started training, and ended up, you know, being a wonderful, very skilled news media pilot. Terry Cook is another one of our graduates that flew for some time for Channel 10. He's now flying in Malaysia. Don Hooper is another one of our graduates who flew for some time for Channel 10 and maybe Channel 5. I'm not sure. And there's probably a couple of others. We've had several of our more recent graduates that flew part-time. You know, Scott Bowerbank was one of my best friends and worked for me for many, many years. I taught him to fly years ago. He unfortunately was one of the people that were killed in the midair that happened in Phoenix in 2007. But Scott was a wonderful guy and one of the best pilots I've ever flown with. And I trained him 1987. We were both just kind of kids, and then he worked his way up the ladder and was very successful in that industry up until the point of the accident.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there've been several, probably I'm missing several of them, I'm sure, but just off the top of my head, that's several of the more commonly known names that were in that industry.
Mm-hmm. And Bruce Hafner, he trained in Scottsdale?
No, Bruce actually was one of Quantum Helicopter's very first students when we were really small, very first getting started. And Scott Bowerbank was working for me in those days, and Scott actually trained Bruce, and we all became friends in that way. And then Bruce went on from that and worked his way up and actually became Channel 3's pilot, after that.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great link there, and a good point of pride for Quantum for sure.
Yeah, so especially in the day, it's fun. Those are good memories because when Bruce was there, we were really small and really struggling to get started, and Bruce, was kind of trying to live his dream as we were trying to get our dream of getting this business up and going.
Mm-hmm.
And I see Bruce still and talk to him a lot. So he's become, like I said, a very good friend. It's fun to share those memories.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you were at the Arizona Wing and Rotor or Rotary? Rotor.
Arizona Wing and Rotor.
Arizona Wing and Rotor. For how many years were you working there?
Almost 9 years, and from 84 till the end of 92.
Okay, so tell me how Quantum came about. How did you get that going?
Well, Arizona Wing and Rotor had actually become I'm not sure I could verify this, but I think it was the largest civilian flight school in the world for several years. A lot of that was due to a very high level or a very large amount of foreign training that we were doing in the late 80s and the early 90s. So we literally kind of outgrew the Scottsdale Airport, and when that happened, the owner at that time of Arizona Wing and Rotor moved the company to Chandler, so I kind of left Chandler, moved to Scottsdale, and then ended up moving back. And the owner's plan was to actually build a building on this airport and locate here because it was much more open and there was more opportunity for development long term on this airport. And about 2 years after moving to Chandler, the economy again went into a bit of a recession, the aviation industry especially. The foreign markets that we had been working with declined fairly sharply, and Arizona Wing and Rotor ended up having some financial difficulty in closing. So when that happened, thankfully we didn't have a lot of notice of that, or it would probably stressed us a lot, but we kind of found out 2 or 3 days before it happened. And at that point I was 29 or 30 years old, and always had, since working for Mr. Copeland in those days, always had dreamed about having my own business. From the days of watching him run Santan Dusters, So I thought, hey, if I'm ever going to try it, it was probably one of the worst times to try it that I could have picked, but if I'm ever going to try it, we almost need to do it now. So when Arizona Wing and Rotor closed, we put together as many resources as we could, and we went from working at, when I say we, a couple of the pilots came with me, Scott Bowerbank and Don Hooper, and a couple of the others that were working for us at that time, and put together the resources we could. Went from working at a great big company to starting over, basically. Mm-hmm. But being a Chandler guy, all my family was here. My wife's family was very close, so we decided to do that from the Chandler Airport. And we kind of jumped in the pool to see if we could learn how to swim. And that was January of 93.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we ended up as Quantum Helicopters and back at the Chandler Airport.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about Well, how'd you come up with the name Quantum for the business?
That actually, you can imagine it was a little bit stressful and difficult in the days of going from working for one company who closes with very little notice and us then immediately starting another small company. So it was a little stressful, but one of the biggest stressors was trying to come up with a name. That was really difficult. And pilots do a lot of things really well, but they're not terribly creative with things like names or designs, or it's not a pilot thing, so all of us pilots would sit around trying to think of, what are we going to call this place? And most of the names were kind of, generic, Southwest Aviation or Professional Helicopters or one thing or another. And I really wanted something that people would remember better, or would be a little bit outside the box, but I couldn't come up with it myself. And finally, my next door neighbor that we were living next to at that time came over one evening and said, "Hey, I've got a great name for you. It's quantum. Let's call it quantum helicopters." He said one of the definitions, one of the definitions of quantum is a indivisible unit of energy or something to that effect. And I said, you know what? Whether people love it or hate it, they'll remember it. It doesn't sound like anything else in aviation. It's different, so that's what we did. Basically, my next door neighbor came up with our name, which I've always been grateful to him for.
Who was that?
And then about 12 years later, I find out that there's a Quantum Helicopters in Canada. So it wasn't as original or as creative as I thought. They're in a completely different segment of the industry than we are, so it really hasn't ever been a conflict. But there is also a Quantum Helicopters in Canada that's been there about the same amount of time, I think, as we have. So that was kind of shocking. But and his name was Wayne, and unfortunately, I haven't seen him in many years. I don't remember his last name. We only lived there next to them for about 8 months, I think. They were wonderful people, him and his wife, and hopefully he won't see this interview and want royalties now for the last 18 years we've been using his name, but that's where we got the name, and it's been good for us. It's worked out the way that I thought it would.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about once you decided to start Quantum and come to the Chandler Airport. Kind of what was the process? Where did you locate at? How did the whole thing start to get built up at the airport?
Well, that was almost 18 years ago, and there weren't many choices. I mean, we were very small. We went from working for an operator that had 21 helicopters and a huge office and everything that came along with that to 2 little R-22s that we had come up with, and literally just about starting the program over. So we came to the Chandler Airport and went to John Walkup, who now owns Chandler Air Service, and we just basically said, "Hey John, do you have any space you could give us?" And we don't need much. We need a little bit of hangar space for the helicopters and a little bit of office space to do the office work. And John was very gracious and helped us as much as he could, and he did have some office space in a building that was relatively new at that time, and so we were able to lease some space from him, both in the hangar and office space, and we took more and more as that first 2.5 to 3 years we were in business went on. We expanded a little bit and ended up having a great relationship with Chandler Air Service there in those very early years. And John was, like I said, him and his wife Diana helped us a lot in those early years being on the Chandler Airport. I don't know what we would have done had it not been for him, having that space available and being able to help us in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And your first kind of clients or customers, were they people that had connections to the old Scottsdale company, or did you kind of use that network to get your first customers? Or
thankfully, there were a few customers that were kind of left, I guess you'd say left hanging when the older company closed, and when we started Quantum, we had a meeting with those folks and said, hey, here's what we're gonna do, and there weren't a lot of them because all of the foreign customers have moved on somewhere else. And that was part of the difficulty in maintaining operations that Arizona and Rotor had. But the domestic customers that we had, I think if I remember, there were 10 or 11 of them, thankfully, all decided to stay. And we explained what we were gonna try to do, and so we had just a little bit, about 2.5 or 3 months worth of work on the table when we opened the doors. And that, even though it went by in a hurry, that was really helpful in getting, literally the phones and the lights and the leases and the power connected, and getting things up and running. It didn't last very long, but that remnant of business was very helpful to us. And then from that point on, we just hung out our shingle, so to speak, started advertising, and the industry was in a very low point at that point, so it really was kind of a bootstrapping thing. But we kept the expenses low, and we were able to make it through that period. And the first 4 years were really pretty difficult. We always made it, but just barely. There'd be a little extra, and then not quite enough, but it always worked out until about 97 is when we really started to feel like we were succeeding succeeding to the point where it wasn't always kind of paycheck to paycheck. Aviation in the early to mid 90s was very difficult, kind of similar to the market that we have right now.
Okay. So did you start out with yourself and then 2 other instructors? Kind of what was your
I
employee
started
base that you started
with myself and 3 other instructors, and we had one part-time office manager that helped with phones and accounting and things like that, and that was our humble start. 2 little R-22 helicopters.
So tell me a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the services that you were providing, and then kind of how that changed, and then maybe kind of work that in with when it was that you moved from using John Walkup's facilities to kind of having your own facility. So talk about how the business evolved after 1993.
Well, in the very early years, because I had worked for another company, much of what you can do in the aviation world requires particular certification and training and approvals from the Federal Aviation Administration. So when the company I'd worked for previously did close, all of that was lost. So we had to start kind of from scratch again. We call that just basically general aviation Part 61, Part 91 operations, and gradually had to build back, under my company, had to build back all of that approval base and certification base. So that took about 3 or 4 years. For example, there's a difference between Part 61 training programs and approved, we call Part 141 training programs. So we had to get all of that done again. Luckily we knew how to do it, but all of that had to be redone. The dealership and the service center for the type of aircraft that we fly, I had to go through the process of getting approved for that. That took 3.5 or 4 years. Our air taxi certificate, and it just on and on. VA approval, the ability to enroll foreign students, so that took us really to do it all about a 4-year period of taking one bite at a time and rebuilding all of that. And then in completely unrelated to anything that I had been involved with, in the past, the city of Chandler had built a heliport on the other side of the airport to where we are now, in the late 80s, that was standing with very little use. And we were operating, like I said, from Chandler Air Services facility in leased buildings. And about 2.5 years after we had started Quantum, the airport came to me, and the Public Works Director, George Sylvia, was in that position at that time, and the airport manager at that time came to us and said, "Hey, we'd really like to work something out to get you to move to the heliport," which would, was a idea that were very much in favor of, but we were very limited on resources at that time, and we were able to work out a deal to make some improvements, get a hangar on the heliport and a small modular office space, so that we could actually move to what we now call the old heliport. And we moved there in November of 1995. And even though that facility was smaller and like I said, it was a modular building, to us it was like the Taj Mahal. We were at an actual heliport. We had our own office space and hangar space, and we had some separation from the fixed wing comings and goings, which was good for both, probably safety and convenience. And that heliport we operated from until August of 2006, when we moved to the facility that we're in now on the new heliport.
Could you shake your mouse real quick? Just move it, your mouse on your computer. Thank you. And put it back on that right side. Thank you.
Okay. Before I get into kind of, I guess how Quantum has changed, and initially you're doing the flight training, and now you've got other pieces to that, so we can talk a little bit about that. But describe kind of what the airport looked like, what you remember about it back in '93 when you started Quantum.
Well, in '93, like I stated, when we went looking for office space originally, there was actually only available at John Walkup's place there at Chandler Air Service. The airport was much more rural, even in '93. In fact, it was kind of one of the concerns in trying to draw customers, which our primary customer base is not local. It's from mostly out of the state domestic customers and some foreign customers. So I was concerned early on that it might be a little bit too rural, because your customers want to have places to dine and places to stay, but it worked out that that wasn't, the city had grown enough by then that the airport was close enough that that didn't become a big problem. When we first opened, I can't remember exactly the dates, but I think there was still only, for a very short period of time, there was still only one operating runway when we very first opened. It didn't take very long before the second runway and taxiway Charlie were put in. So, and then about 2 years later, the first temporary tower came online. So when we very first opened in '93, there was no control tower. The airport operations were still operating out of the old terminal. So the airport was really, a lot of the private hangars had not been built. It was fairly small, and not a tremendous amount of activity going on, in those early '90s years.
Okay.
Crop duster that had all been had either moved or gone away by that time. The crop dusting activity had pretty much ended, in the late '80s. So that part of the airport was quite a bit different also.
Okay. Okay, so this kind of gets to that next question. So John Walkup's companies there and his operations, and were there any other businesses operating out of the airport?
Sure, there was Chandler Aviation. Yes, Frank had started Chandler Aviation there, or had purchased Button Aviation, which became Chandler Aviation. And they're still here at Chandler today. Varga was still operating, Mr. Varga, although they weren't building airplanes anymore. They had the parts industry, or the parts sales that they were doing, and they're still here today. Venture Aviation was in business at that time. So actually the group of operators that were there in '93 are all still, as far as I know, they're all still operating and still on the airport. And we were the kind of the new operation on the block at that point.
The new kids on the block.
Yeah.
The young ones. Okay.
We were called worse than that at times, but some, there's always been a healthy rivalry between the fixed wing operators and helicopter operators, but actually on this airport, everyone has always gotten along very well, I think. It's been a really comfortable and good place to operate from. The operators have always had good relationships, and even the tower has always, with as many fixed wing and as many helicopters as we have now at this airport, it's been a great place to be, and everybody has really worked together to make it a very safe, efficient operation.
Okay. Talk a little bit about, there's a lease that's involved, kind of like, you have a private business that's on the municipal airport. What's that relationship like, and that kind of thing?
Well, as is true with almost any airport with any level of sophistication, I mean, any airport of any size that's part of a city with any size, the land surrounding the actual runways and the airport itself is almost always owned by the city. So operators that want to develop businesses or actually build buildings and facilities at an airport, in almost every case you lease the land, or you have a land lease, and then you build your facility on that land lease. And then at the end of the lease, the building, if a new lease is not negotiated, then the building or the hard property that has been developed reverts back to the ownership of the city. So there's pros and cons with that type of a system, but that is in general the way that most airports of any size operate, and that is in fact the type of program that we're on here at Chandler. We have basically a 50-year lease, and we built the building and have a 50-year lease to operate here at the new heliport.
So that started in 2006?
That started in 2006, yes.
Okay, so you're committed to being at the airport?
We're committed, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Tell me a little bit about kind of how your operations and the services that you provided have changed since 1993 to present day.
Well, in '93, as I said, it was very basic. What we could offer then was pretty much Part 61 flight training, very basic flight training, and aerial photography. I mean, literally, that was just about all that we could do. Over the years, we have been able to get all of our programs from the very beginning or simplest programs all the way through the very advanced levels of certification. All of them we have established and have them all approved by the FAA. They're all Part 141 courses. We have established a dealership and service center for the Robinson products. So we sell a lot of aircraft and maintain a lot of aircraft, not only our own, but for customers in the local area, and some not so local. Flight training has always been our core business, but we're able to do a lot more of it now because we can pretty much do any type of training that's in the helicopter scope of operations, which we weren't able to do coming right out of the gate in 1993. We also do a lot more commercial work, charter work, survey. We've done on-demand type of work for police departments and news stations and newspapers, and so those are all aspects of what we do, with the core really being the flight school and the dealership operations around the Robinson products.
Okay. Do you have an interesting on-demand job that kind of stands out in your mind as something that came up and it was kind of unique or interesting that you guys did?
Well, yes, probably we could talk a long time about that, but you know, some of the more interesting jobs that we've done have been looking for, we get called every once in a while to look for stolen equipment, because you really can see just about everything from the helicopter altitudes that we fly. And those are always interesting, because usually when people hire us to do that, they know who stole their equipment. And it's usually hiding right where they think it is. So those are interesting jobs. We've been several times called out to assist families who are missing either animals or family members. We have been hired to fly for the Chandler Police Department on limited occasions to supplement some of the things they're doing. That's always been very interesting and fun work. You know, we've been involved with a couple of small aerial or pursuit things in the past that have been fun. A couple of you know, I got to fly around Magnum, the guy from Magnum PI, you know, their helicopter pilot back in the, his name was TC, I think. Roger Mosley, I think, was his real name. But I got to fly around with him one night years ago, and that was really interesting, because, you know, I kind of grew up watching Magnum, and now I'm flying around the pilot, and he actually was a pilot. He didn't fly in the show. So yeah, we've had some really interesting flying. A lot of it is the places that we go that I find the most interesting, because we get out away from civilization and we're able to see a lot of things. I've seen some wonderful geographic scenery and canyons, and you know, you start to realize how beautiful a place the Southwest is when you get out away from the cities a little bit. And the helicopters really allow you to go pretty much, it's the closest thing to being a bird that you can really get. I've seen some amazing wildlife out in the open and in the wild, you know, from the air. So those are probably my favorite things. That and some of the interesting people that we meet that are drawn to helicopters. Those are probably my favorite things about being in this business.
Mm-hmm. And currently, how often are you actually flying as an instructor or doing these contract type of jobs or anything like that?
Me personally?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you talk to my pilots, they would tell you I don't fly very much. But I always seem to be, to me, I still think I fly quite a bit. I probably fly 200 hours a year still, doing different things. And really, it is, to me, it's been a real blessing, because it's a mix of the two worlds that I've really enjoyed being involved in. One is to be an entrepreneur and to run a business. I've always wanted to do that, and thankfully I've been able to now. And I'm able to fly enough to where it doesn't get old. It's still enjoyable and fun. You know, like all jobs, you still have days where you have a particular job that's a little more stressful or more work than other days. But all in all, I really can't complain. I still am able to fly enough to where it really is enjoyable for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How many employees does Quantum have now?
Well, we're a lot slower than we have been in the past because of the current state of the economy, but we have now, I think, 9 pilots, and then 4 guys that work in the maintenance area,
Mhm.
and a couple of office workers.
Mhm. And you have at least couple ladies that work here?
Yes, we have, as we speak, we have 3 female pilots, yeah.
Excellent. Has that been, did you kind of initially start out with more male pilots, and then how has that changed gender-wise?
Well, the industry or the market affects that to some degree because there aren't nearly as many female pilots that start training. So, and that has grown over the years, that they're becoming more and more, it's becoming more and more normal to have at any given time, 15 or 20% of our student base to be female. But in the early days when I was instructing, it was very, very seldom that we, not because of any reason, it's just female pilots weren't attracted, to the industry very often. Now that's turned around, and we do have a lot more female pilots that are training and going to work. So it wasn't really by design, it's just the way the industry has evolved. When I think I said earlier, when I got started as a civilian helicopter pilot, even that was very unusual, because almost everyone up until 1981 or 82, if you were a helicopter pilot, you learned in the military. That was just the norm. The ex-Vietnam era had produced a lot of helicopter pilots. So, but now we see very much increased numbers in the numbers of females that are training, and we have 3 out of the 9 here now that work for us. In fact, my chief pilot is female, and Missy Powering, she's been with us for 12 years. She finished her training here as a student and then worked her way up the ladder. And yeah, we've, some of our female pilots have been the best that we've ever had.
Great. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about. Let me ask a question real quick. Where are we at on time?
We're over 1 o'clock. We're like at 1:10, 1:15.
You have somebody at 1?
Did he tap you and let you know that person's here, or no?
Yeah, he's on the other line.
Is this a walk-around appointment, or is it you need to bring him into the office?
I don't need to necessarily bring him in here, but it's a school tour, so that could be 5 minutes or it could be an hour and a half. It's hard to know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I have like 4 more questions for you.
Yeah, let's finish. Let me see. Hey, Doug.
I've had to plug everything in.
So it's my 1 o'clock here.
As we're going, I plugged
Are
in
you taking
this.
care of her somehow?
I plugged in the Zoom.
Okay, we got just a few more minutes here. We're running late, so beg my forgiveness and do what you can.
I will.
All right, thanks.
Well, one of the things that I want to focus on with this next question is kind of like in your current customer base and in regards to the students that you're training. Maybe tell me a little bit about. I'm really interested in the fact that it has an international kind of nature to it, and I think it would be good for the public to know who Quantum trains. So maybe tell me a little bit about that.
Well, over the years, we have trained customers from really just about any place in the industrial or the industrialized world, and that kind of peaks and valleys a little bit at different times, depending on what's going on overseas and in other countries and in their markets. We will see more demand for foreign training at some times and less demand at others. So again, most of our business or our customers are not necessarily local. It's kind of unusual for us to have, because there's only so many people in the local area that are going to be attracted to helicopter training. It's kind of a niche business, but the majority of our customers are either from other states that come here specifically for helicopter training and they do this full time, or from other countries. So in fact, I expect to see in the next, well, at least within the next 18 months, a much larger component of our training base to be foreign related because of the downturn in the market in the United States, and some of the demand for helicopter pilots in the foreign countries is on the rise, actually, as ours has kind of stagnated a little bit periodically. So it kind of goes up and down with whatever's going on in the world economy.
Mm-hmm. And how does that that international base of pilots, how does that exposure affect Chandler, do you think?
Well, I think it affects, obviously it brings people from all over the globe to Chandler and exposes them to, you know, the Chandler lifestyle and the businesses in Chandler. We have had customers who've actually decided to live here longer term, those that could work it out, because many times they come to this area and fall in love with it. You know, the weather and the lifestyle that we have here really is, to most of the foreign pilots that come over, is very attractive to them. Most of them that do have to leave are very unhappy to have to do that. And it does bring in a lot of peripheral business, you know, to the other businesses in Chandler. Most of our students rent apartments here or rent homes here to stay during the duration of their training, and of course they buy food and bicycles and cars and fuel and everything else while they're here. So it is, in that way, it's good for all of us to have them, you know, the draw of bringing in people from out of the city, you know, into the Chandler market.
Mm-hmm. How long does that training go for?
Most of the pilots that we train will be here anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half, depending on what they're doing. And then those of the domestic pilots that we graduate, the majority of those pilots will also end up working here as entry-level employees for another year to 2 years. So the total time that they're here could be, you know, anywhere from a year to 3 years, depending on what course they take.
Okay. Now let's jump a little bit, just the last couple questions here in regards to kind of how you see the significance of the airport in general for the community, economically or whatever that is. Having been located here for a number of years and been very involved with the airport and its development, and kind of seeing how the community has changed and grown and seen the airport. What would you say would be what makes the airport important to Chandler, I guess is the question.
Well, I think for many years cities have realized the economic benefit of having airports, not only directly from the aviation business that's based on the airport, but the peripheral business and the fact that many light industrial and corporate operations that would base themselves in a particular city need the lifeline or the transportation link that an airport provides. Historically, and most studies and most economic development surveys would indicate that airports are very important for, especially for an up-and-coming community that's growing very quickly in its level of sophistication. You know, like I said, even our small business brings a lot of people in from out of state, out of town, out of the country even, and exposes them to Chandler and brings economic activity here to bring dollars to Chandler. So if you times that by several businesses on the airport, and then the businesses that may not locate at Chandler unless they're able to have access to a transportation hub that the airport provides, I think the airport has been and probably even more so in the future. In the next 30 years, because of the way Chandler's developed and gone from a more agricultural base to a more corporate and business related community, the airport, even more so over the next 30 years, the airport's going to be important to the types of businesses and the speed at which Chandler can attract, especially the more technical and upper level corporate and industrial type user. So hopefully that will happen, and as the economy turns around and starts to move in the right direction, which we all hope happens fairly soon, the airport will be standing there and waiting for that type of development. There's still a tremendous amount of potential and area for development at this airport.
Mm-hmm. And we've heard that Intel just decided to invest a little bit more in Chandler. And you probably heard about that kind of big announcement
Mm-hmm.
that they're doing. So we can see that that technology-based business is still interested in Chandler. So,
Right.
so hopefully the airport will be an important link for that.
Absolutely.
What do you think is most important to know or to highlight about the history of the airport to the community?
Well, personally, I think it's just, I think part of the project that you're involved in this documenting some of the history of the airport and promoting it is probably long overdue. The airport's kind of flown under the radar, so to speak, for many, many years, as the city has been one of the fastest growing cities in the United States over the last 3 decades. The airport didn't, draw a tremendous amount of attention on the positive aspect of what it provides, and I think historically that's probably the most important thing, is that we're able to educate folks and educate the citizens of Chandler as to the long history that the airport has, and that significant investment has been made by local and state and federal resources and private business, to make it a viable part of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And really the economic development potential and the type of users that the airport can attract going into the future is really, I think, important for us to let people know, hey, it's here, it has been here a long time, and it's going to be a major player, especially in the southern part of Chandler, in the way things develop, over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, as a Chandler native, feel about, how do you connect to the Chandler airport as a Chandler native?
Well, of course, for me, the airport I have been much more involved in the airport than just about anybody in Chandler. There's, I hate to say it, but I kind of have become an airport old timer now, so the airport has always been a very big part of especially my young adult life up until now. And it probably always will be. It's, where in the last 18 to 20 years, that's where I've made my living, and I have very fond memories of the airport, from my younger years, being out here and getting started in my career. So, of course, I'm very supportive of the airport, and I recognize the positive potential that it carries, and the positive service that it's doing right now, towards the city and the citizens of Chandler.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And are there any other specific memories that you'd like to share to the community, as far as about the airport, or anything else you'd like to add?
I don't know about my particular memories, but I would encourage anybody, as most of the airport operators and people that are based here and work and operate here, even those that use the airport as private transportation for their own private airplanes and helicopters. I would just encourage anybody that may see this or that may come across this interview or the others that are being done about the airport to come out and see it. And if the airport's something that you're not familiar with, come out and meet some of the operators and you know, one of the things I'd like to see us do in the future, that the airport operators have started doing an annual airport day, which was long overdue. And when I was a kid, though, the airport would have some type of a airport event, usually at least once a year. And we've started that over the last couple of years. So I just invite anyone that might see this to come out, experience the airport, and see what it's all about. That probably would be better than me sharing any other memory or anything like that.
Okay, last question. What is it that you love about flying?
I love pretty much everything about flying. I mentioned before in the interview that helicopters are the closest thing so far that we've been able to get to actually flying like a bird, you know. Being able to go where you want to go, being able to slow down or speed up within reason, being able to land where you want to land. And that is the biggest joy about flying helicopters for me. You know, it is the ability to fly like a bird. And I do still fly airplanes occasionally, and I love flying airplanes too. And the real cool thing about airplanes is going fast, you know, which the helicopters don't do very well. So between the two, that really is what always intrigued me about flying, was being able to get up above everything and go, miss the traffic, go straight line, and in the helicopter world especially, being able to stop along the way when you want to. That's what makes it fun for me.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I know that was a long interview, but
It goes
There's
by
a
fast.
lot
though.
of Yeah,
I
you-
can't believe it's
story.
1:30 already.
Right, you're thinking like you didn't have it, you know, well, I have a lot to say or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're like, there's more I could have said, but I gotta go. So, yeah, awesome.
I'm thinking maybe we can come back to do some B-roll stuff.
I was gonna
Another
tell you
time?
that I wasn't planning to do it
Yeah.
today because one, because it's cloudy, and
Yeah.
two, because of the day.
The time frame. So maybe we can come back and do some B-roll and stuff like that. And could we see you get in a helicopter and fly it?
Sure.
Something like that would be really great.
We'll go flying. I'll put you in there with me and we'll go.
I'll go.
Sure.
That would be very exciting.
Yeah, just give me a few days heads up before you want to do that. We can do that easy.
Because it'd be great to like shoot, like you in the cockpit and
Sure.
all that stuff would be really fun.
Fly over Chandler a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that.
That would be
Oh,
awesome.
that's crazy. Yeah. Cool. We need to go. It'll take me 10 minutes to get out of your office.
That's
so.
all right. Take your time, but I'm going to run down there and
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Make
Thank
my
you.
apologies.
Yes.
And if you need to, you can come up here and we'll put them on camera and all of a sudden things go away.
make
Let me
it,
get that.
make it
You're
feel
like,
like a star. Huh?
They're like, oh, okay, yeah, that was great. Yeah. This is?
There it is. Right there.
Thank you for
Oh,
being patient and
you bet.
doing that. That was a lot of fun. I love hearing about your family history too. That's great. Now it makes me want to go
Oops,
see if
Man, although
Let me
it's
turn this
embarrassing a
off.
little bit because I should probably know it better. I mean, when you start asking, I'm like, oh, I hope she didn't go too deep in this because I could, like my grandfather's name.